If you have purchased a Canon R8, you are in the right place. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the basic operation of the camera, including all of the buttons and controls, the symbols and icons you'll see and what they mean. We will talk about changing your focus, controlling the brightness of the image, which is called exposure. We're going to talk about ISO, in white balance, in metering. I'm going to show you how to use the touch operation of the screen and get you familiar with your camera. My name is Michael Andrew, and I'm going to be your host and instructor on this Canon R8 tutorial. This video is brought to you by Maven filters. This is a filter line that I designed. I'm very proud of it. At some point in your photography career, you're going to want to get filters. Maven filters, in my opinion, there's nothing better on the planet. If this is your first camera, I would definitely recommend watching this video from start to finish. If you're an experienced photographer, or you're reviewing the lessons, or this isn't your first rodeo, I would strongly recommend using the table of contents. We've spent a lot of time putting this together, and the way that works is you're going to hit Control F or Command F, type in the subject matter that you're interested in, do a search, and if we have a chapter marker for it, there'll be some time code there. You can click on it, and it will jump you to that lesson. It's a very powerful reference, like a video reference tool. Now, if you are a beginning photographer, I have to give you a word of warning. This video will cover the operation of the camera only. It is not enough for you to become a consistently great photographer. There's a ton of other things that you will need to know. For example, the basics of photography. When would you want one shutter speed over another? How does your aperture affect your depth of field? What are the drawbacks of ISO? And then there's things like lighting and composition. Then we talk about the advanced features. The cameras today are far more advanced than when I got started in 2003. I can always remember the frustration I had when I was learning photography that I wanted to take my camera and throw it into a wall because I was so frustrated. I knew in my mind what I wanted to do, but I couldn't do it with the camera. And that is the idea of the crash course. It is a paid course. This is like my interview. I'm showing you if you like the way that I teach. And if you do, I would highly recommend it. There's probably no faster, easier way to take advantage and learn how to really use your camera. It's designed to take a pure beginner and get them up to an advanced shooting level in about 6 or 7 hours. I've had many students over the years who cut out that learning curve. Now, the reason I tell you all this is that if we hear enough from our students asking for me to make an R8 crash course, we will do it. They take a lot of work, about 4 to 6 weeks of production time to put that together. But basically, we do it on demand. So if enough people ask, put it together, and when it's ready, we will email you. So if you're interested in the R8 crash course, let us know. We also have a Facebook group where you can share your images, ask questions, get feedback, things of that nature. Put that link in the description as well. We have a ton of information to cover, so let's get started. I just want to give you some words of encouragement. And remember that when I got started on my own, before YouTube, it took me 2 years to learn how to use a camera through trial and error. And I promised myself I would make it easier for beginners like you to learn much faster. You are in very good hands. You are going to learn this material, and within a couple hours, you might have to watch it more than once. Within a couple hours, you're going to be shooting at least on an intermediate level, possibly with some practice and some experience on a beginning advanced level. So this is really consolidating everything together. It's going to save you a lot of time. And I'm also going to be pointing out some other tips and recommendations that you won't find on other videos because I have a lot of experience and I can warn you about some pitfalls and make recommendations. The first thing we're going to do is put a shoe on the bottom of the camera. If you look on the bottom of the camera, we have this little mount. And I love the Bogen Monfrotto ball heads. This is the one I've been using. I have actually have many of these, but this is the particular model that I've been using for years. Ball heads are fantastic. Get this thing. So here's a shoe. And you'll notice it has a little lip on it. I'll make some tripod recommendations at the end of the video with some lens recommendations. So I've screwed this on. And the reason why I like this is because it allows me to put the lip in, push down, and now it is locked that fast. And when I want to release it, I lift this lever up and it pops out. I prefer this over the Arca Swiss plates. I just think it's faster and more reliable. Now, something that the ball head will do is it'll allow you to move the camera into different positions. Any good tripod will allow you to replace the head that you're using. So if you're shooting video work, you are going to be using a different head. something that's really good at panning and tilting, or going from left and right or up and down. Next, let's put a battery and some memory cards in there. You should have gotten a battery with your camera. This is the LPE17. Definitely recommend having more than one. I have a buddy, Scott Drexler, who when he got started, he was shooting with the RP, uses a similar battery, and he would carry, 5 or 6 of these, but he would go out and shoot weddings professionally. So full frame sensor is a game changer if you're doing portraits, landscape photography. It's really incredible what that size sensor will do. But the battery size is a little small on this. You're going to want to get a couple more. When we open our battery gate, you'll notice that there's some pins in there towards the camera body. You'll notice they line up with these. So we're going to put the pins towards the camera. There's a couple things I want to point out here about this gate. You'll notice there's a little lever here that if you push this to the side, it'll depress this pin and this pin will come out. You can actually take this off. Why would you want to do that? Canon gives us a little diagram here. Basically, we have 2 batteries here. And so the idea on this is that if you are going to be shooting with a certain battery grip that will fit in here, you will be able to remove this gate and apply that battery grip, which we've not seen on other Canon cameras like the R7. So that's very nice to see this. When we're talking about memory cards, I like SanDisk Extreme Pros. These 2 cards look very similar with the exception of the memory size, 64 gigabytes and 128 gigabytes. The truth of the matter is they are very different. And I'll show you on the back. This one has 2 rows of pins, and this one only has 1. This is a UHS-1 memory card. This is a UHS-2 memory card. In our R8, we'll use both of them, but the main differences between these two is UHS-2 memory cards write much faster than UHS-1 memory cards. Anytime you're doing lots of high-speed bursts, you're going to want a UHS-2 memory card. Over the life of your camera, that will pay you dividends. And what I tell all of my friends, beginning photographers, try to invest a little bit of money into a high-quality memory card. Now, there are some tests out there where you can see the different write speeds for different memory cards, and there are some that are better than the SanDisk Extreme Pros, but I've used these for almost my entire career, and I've almost never had any problems with them. Suffice it to say, I've had some problems with some other ones. Something else I want to point out is that if you look, there's a little symbol in here. It says U3. This is the minimum that you will need if you plan on recording 4K video. I get a lot of emails from students who say, hey, I found a memory card and I put it in my camera and the video just stops. That's because the memory card has to be class U3 if you're going to write 4K video to it. So make sure you have that symbol if you're not getting any of these cards. It's a little worn off, but we can see that the read speed here is 300 megabytes per second, and the read speed on the UHS-1 is 95. The write speed, if I remember correctly, I think it's 260 or something like that. Much faster card, and this is the one we're going to go with. Kind of hard to see, but there's a little icon that has one of the corners cut off, and it's showing you the direction that it should go in. So in this case, pins towards the grip. Whenever I get a new camera, I get one of these metallic Sharpies, and you'll see there's a little notch here, and I'll just come in and write on that notch just like that. And the reason is this has very low contrast, and when you're putting your lens cap on and off, you want to see where this tick mark is. It is going to line up with the red tick mark. Here's our sensor on the lens body. And I also do the same with my lens caps. So I always know where these are supposed to line up. And the idea on this is that red tick mark goes to red tick mark. And I'm going to rotate it until it clicks. When you need to remove a lens, you're going to push and hold this down and rotate the lens off. Now, a word of caution about changing your lenses. When you're changing your lenses, try to do it in a place that is not windy. So if you're outdoors, make sure the wind is not blowing when this happens. And try to change your lenses with the sensor turned down. We live in a microbe world, which means there's lots of particles and dusts and bugs and all kinds of things just floating in the air that we can't see. And if you leave your camera open, you're going to increase the probability that you're going to get sensor dust. Sensor dust looks like these little specks. They're like gray and black. You'll see them when you're shooting at smaller sized apertures. And it's annoying when you see it. So to minimize that, always try to change your lenses with the sensor pointing down. Try to do it quickly. And if the wind's blowing, just wait or until you get into your car or something like that, because it's going to save you the hassle of cleaning your sensor. Now, if we go ahead and do the R8 crash course, I will demonstrate how to clean your sensor physically, show you the tools that I use, and show you that it's not that hard to do it once you know the right steps to take. When you are ready to start using ND filters, polarizers, things of that nature, we can thread filters into the front of our lens and we find the size. Sometimes it'll be written on the lens, but on most lens caps, kind of hard to see. It'll also be on the backside of the cap, in this case, 43 millimeters. Maven Filters makes filters for this lens all the way up to 112 millimeters. So when you're ready for ND filters, check those out. Before we get into the operation of the camera, I'm going to take you on a tour of all of the buttons and controls. Then we're going to talk about the symbols and icons, how to navigate through the different menus, and then we're going to get into some great lessons. Obviously, this is the shutter button. And by the way, if you don't have your camera, pause the video, go grab your camera, and follow along with your camera in hand. The shutter button obviously takes the picture, but something you should know is that it also engages focusing. If you push this shutter button halfway down, you will feel a spongy resistance, and that will engage the camera's focusing systems by default. So when we are focusing with the camera by default, we push the shutter button halfway down, and when we are ready to take the shot, we push it down all the way, and you'll hear the shutter click when that happens. This guy right here is an autofocus assist lamp, and if you're in dark situations, you'll see it turn on. It will also blink when you're using the timer. These little dimples here are the microphones for video recording. Keep in mind that the microphones in the camera are not great, and as you handle the camera and move it around, those vibrations are picked up by the microphone and it just doesn't sound good. So I definitely will make mic recommendations at the end of this video. You're going to need an external microphone. Something that's unique to most Canon RF lenses is they have this thing called the control ring. And in this case, we have a control focus switch, which means if it's pointed at focus, this will allow us to focus. If we have it turned to the control ring, it will allow us to customize it to use it in different ways, such as white balance, maybe our ISO, just things that you want to have more control over. Focus is generally reserved for when we are in manual focus, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's talk about what is under each of these three gaskets. This one's super important because we have our microphone jack where we would plug in an external microphone. So if you do a lot of video recording, you're going to want that external microphone plugged in here. You're going to want to have a headset plugged in here so you can hear the sound as it's being recorded to the camera. Above it, we have our remote terminal jack. Under this port here, we have our micro HDMI. We also have our USB-C terminal. This little guy right here is called our diopter adjustment. So if you use corrective eyewear, like contacts, for example, this will allow you to change the focus of your EVF, your electronic viewfinder. It's a little television, but we can change the focus using this guy right here. And we do so by rotating it up or down. Next to it, we have the deep menu button. When we're looking at the top of the camera over here, obviously we have the power switch, and halfway between the on and the off, we have the lock position, which will allow you to prevent settings from changing if you were to rotate them accidentally. Just behind the shutter button, we have the MFN button, or the multi-function button, which will allow us to select different types of settings in the EVF. So when you push this, you'll see those menus pop up. I typically recommend customizing this once you get a hang of your camera. This guy right here, I like to refer to it as the primary selector because we use our index finger, which is number 1, on the primary selector. So this guy right here, I like to call the secondary control wheel for a very specific reason. Primary, secondary, and I will demonstrate this when we get into the modes. Speaking of which, this is the mode dial, and you will use it to give instructions to the camera in terms of how much help it should be giving you, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Right here is the video record button. Typically, we want to be in the video mode by pushing this guy over, but we can also record while we are in the photography mode as well. I'm filming this from a very peculiar angle, and the reason is I want you to take note of these gold contact pins at the end of the hot shoe mount. The hot shoe mount is typically where we install a flash. For flash photography, there's also a number of accessories that will fit on here. But what Canon has done recently is they've changed their hot shoes to include these accessory pins that can do a number of different things with different types of Canon accessories. Canon strobes, or the speed lights, are rather expensive, and I think they're trying to keep some of the competition away from Canon cameras. Companies like Godox, for example. Godox makes a generic flash that used to work pretty well, but in order for TTL flash photography to work now, there's a special adapter that you have to buy from Canon. It's like 40 or 50 bucks. And you would have to adapt that flash over. Otherwise, you're only going to get manual strobe. It's kind of a pain. Something to keep in mind, if you go with a Canon flash, you could be looking at $400 or $500 and up higher. If you go with a Godox flash, it's like $130 plus the cost of the adapter. Keep in mind these gold contact pins, they are fragile. You can damage them if you are not careful. Throw this cover back in. When we're talking about the back of the camera, there are some other important controls here. We have this little speaker here. We have our info button, which I will demonstrate in just a moment. We have our directional pad with a Q and a set button in the middle of it. We have our playback button, our delete button. We have our back button focusing, the AF on button right here. The star icon is auto exposure lock or flash exposure lock if you are using a speed light or a strobe. This little target guy right here, I like to call it the cluster selector, and it's typically used when changing your focusing squares. When you see these blue icons, this means we're doing something during playback. So if we play, we're in playback, this becomes a magnifying tool that I will show you some other ways to interact with a touch monitor. With this in mind, let's get the camera turned on. I'm gonna flip the monitor around. And you should see something like this the first time you set it up. I'm gonna set this up real quick. Once we're all set up, hit OK, and it should remember these settings. Now that our camera is up and running, there's something I want to show you right next to the viewfinder. This little window right here is when I move my pencil in front of it, you'll notice the back monitor turns off, and then when I move it again, it turns back on. This is a battery saving feature, and the idea is that as we raise the camera to our eye, the sensor detects it, and it turns on the EVF. There's different ways to control this in the deep menu. If you come into our yellow page and we go screen viewfinder display, we can turn the viewfinder on all the time. We can turn the screen on all the time. And this auto switching deals when the monitor is out. You can't really see it because of the way I'm set up, but if it comes out here like this and you block the sensor, nothing happens. I'll try to get it in there a little bit. Nothing happens to the monitor. This is really handy if you're shooting on gimbals, but for now, we're going to leave it right here. So again, to access the deep menu, you press the menu button, and you'll notice that we have all of these different colors here. Along the top, we can navigate through it with a touch. Different colors designate shooting, focusing, playback, Wi-Fi connectivity. We have our different camera settings, custom camera settings, and then we have a customizable tab for whatever we want to save. Anytime you're in the menu system, if you tap the shutter button, it'll bring you back out to shooting. Next, let me demonstrate the touch monitor during playback. So when we press play, we can scroll through the images just as we would on a smartphone. It's very intuitive, touch and drag. These are some pictures from a safari I went on last November, and they were taken with the R5, but I wanted to put these pictures on here for demonstration purposes. Is that, by the way, if you go on a safari, go to Kenya. It was amazing. We can pinch our fingers out, and we can zoom in on this leopard. See the detail of the shot we got there. It was a great time. You'll notice here we see this little sun icon. That is prompting the primary selector. So if we rotate the primary selector, we can zoom in. We can use the directional pad to get, a little bit of direction control. But if we go the other way, we are zooming out. We get these smaller thumbnails that would allow us to see all of the images that we currently have on the card. If we wanted to jump through images, we could rotate the rear thumbnail, or we could just continue to do this. I think this is kind of fun just to do it this way. And when we're done, again, we can tap the shutter button and we're ready to shoot. The next thing I want to do is to familiarize yourself with what all these numbers and icons mean. So if you have your camera, what I want you to do is to press the info button. Just practice pushing this a couple times. I get a lot of emails from people saying, hey, I got this weird screen. How do I get away from it? Just push that info button 20 times. So this is how we cycle through the different shooting screens with different sets of information. Some of them have more information. Some of them have less information. When we tap the shutter button, we can pull up these numbers that are kind of hidden. We'll talk about these in just a second. Kind of hard to see, but in every single camera, there's 3 settings you're always going to pretty much want to keep your eye on. In this case, it's given as a fraction, 1/60th of a second. This is referring to our shutter speed. Next to it, we have this letter F next to a number, 4.5. This deals with the size of the lens opening. These 2 factors right here are what control how much light is entering the lens. And f-stops are a little confusing because as that number gets smaller, like 1.2 or 1.4, we're talking about a very large opening. As this number gets higher, f8, f13, f22, it starts to get smaller and smaller. So the larger the f-stop number, the smaller the opening. The smaller the number, the wider the opening. And it's these 2 factors which control how much light is entering the lens. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment. Over here on the far right, we have another very important control. This is ISO. What I want you to do is go ahead and tap it, and I want you to get out of auto ISO. Auto ISO means the camera is going to change the ISO for you, and I do not want that to happen. I want you to be changing the ISO. The ISO number is the digital equivalent of film speeds. When I say film speeds, some films are more sensitive to light than others. In the case of a digital sensor, lower ISO numbers are less sensitive to light, meaning if you're shooting in a very bright condition, you may want to turn your ISO down. If you're shooting in a very dark condition, you may want to turn your ISO up, and there's some trade-off we'll talk about a little bit later. Higher ISOs basically mean that we're allowing the camera to give a boost to the light signal coming into the camera, and there is some trade-off to this. It's not always going to be pretty, but I'll demonstrate this a little bit later. The main thing here is to know that your shutter speed, it is stated in fractions. The aperture is stated with the letter F, and typically we'll see the letters ISO when we're looking at our ISO. And for beginners, I typically recommend shooting between, 400 and 1600 when you're just getting started. These numbers are so important that when you look through your EVF, you will see mirror numbers that reflect your current shutter speed settings, your exposure settings. That's what these are. These 3 guys right here. Now there's some other symbols and icons I'd like to point out. In the top left-hand corner, we have our current mode. It's on P or program. If I rotate it, you'll see it change. And I'm not a huge fan of these menus changing because I think they slow things down. So I'm going to turn those off and show you how to do it. We're going to come into our menu and we're going to turn off the mode guide and the feature guide. Just makes it easier to go through. If we go to aperture priority, you can see AV. The numbers within the brackets are the number of shots remaining with our current image quality settings. It's how many more you can fit on the memory card, and this is maxed out just under 10,000. The number to the right of the bracket is how many shots you could get in a burst. So in this case, 99. To the right of that, you can see that we have a record limit for video of 2 hours. We have our battery life indicator. We have our Q mode button, which I'll demonstrate in a second. Here we have our focal length indicator, 45 millimeters. This bracket here, right here, is our exposure compensation bracket, and I'll show you how this works a little bit later. We have our magnifying glass if we wanted to zoom in on the monitor. We could also touch and drag. We can zoom in a little more to get to 10x, or we can punch out. This guy over here is our touch shutter. Very useful when you're doing certain kinds of landscape photography or macro photography, where you can touch on the monitor and the camera will take the picture. If that's not what you're intending to do, it can be really annoying. If we touch it again, we've disabled it. And now we're just moving our focusing square around. So we've covered the numbers and icons on this screen, and when we push the info button, you can see we get tons of secondary settings here on the sides. We're going to come back to those in just a moment. Pushing it again, we get an electronic level. I'm like right on the point where I'm almost level right there. And you'll notice that in the inside of it, we also get this up and down level. So when it's all lined up and everything's just right, it should look something like this when it's perfectly level. Here is our histogram. This is a statistical tool that tells us how even or over or underexposed we are. As this peak moves to the left, your image is going to be darker or have more black tones in it. And as it moves to the right, your image is going to have more brighter tones in it. If it's completely cut off, then the image will be white completely. But this is a tool that's been around for a long time, especially in digital photography, that tells us how evenly exposed our image is. If we press the info button again, we get nothing. If we press it again, we're taken to the black quick screen. But you'll notice that if I touch on the screen, nothing's happening. I can't change any of these other controls. If you'll notice, there's a Q here, and there's also a Q on this button. So when I push this, we get this orange highlight, and I can scroll and navigate over any of these settings. I can tap the shutter button to get out of it, or I can press this Q button. And same thing, I can jump in and select, or I can touch on the item, and then I can touch and drag those settings. It's very nice. It's very easy to use. It's very intuitive to just touch and drag certain settings, especially if I wear reading glasses. Sometimes I can't really see the small print. This is really a nice way to change the settings. Let me walk you through what each of these are. I'm going to turn the mode dial over to manual because it will allow me to walk you through everything. In the Q screen, there's different ways we can interact with it. You'll notice these orange icons. Here's the primary selector wheel, the front wheel. Here's the rear selector wheel. So we can rotate these. Anytime you see those orange dials, that means that is what the control is going to change. Shutter speed, F is aperture, ISO. Here we have our exposure compensation bracket again. Talk about this in just a moment. And next to it, you'll see this little lightning bolt plus minus sign. This is our flash exposure compensation bracket. Come into there, we would see it. This allows us to control the brightness of a compatible flash. Coming down to the next level, let's come over here. Picture styles, I like to think of them as recipes that bake our images in slightly different flavors. If you're just getting started, auto should be fine. We also have standard. These are generally pretty good when you're just getting started. But as we continue to scroll, we see we have portrait, landscape, fine detail, neutral. And what this means is that those settings have been tuned for those types of shooting. For example, flesh tones for portraits are supposed to be more accurate with this picture style. Or maybe your blues and greens will be more vivid, fine detail, neutral. We have faithful, monochrome, which is black and white, and we have some user-defined settings, which are very popular with videographers who want to tweak their settings as they're recording video. If you want to tweak this, which I don't recommend for beginners, you would press Info, and you could adjust the sharpness strength, sharpness fineness, threshold, contrast, saturation, and color tone. And these settings are going to apply to your JPEGs and your videos. For now, just stick with auto or standard. White balance settings. Our white balance is essentially helping the camera determine the color of the light we're shooting in. I'll demonstrate some things a little bit later. In the beginning, stick with auto white balance, and it actually does pretty good on Canon cameras. But the idea on these others is that we would adjust the icon to the type of light we're shooting in, and it would be more accurate. And there's also some ways to do a custom white balance as well as a Kelvin white balance. And I'll give a little lesson on those later in the video. So next to it, we have our white balance shift and bracket. This is something I do not recommend if you are a beginner. I rarely, if ever, use this. It allows us to adjust the color of our white balance towards green, blue, amber, or magenta by moving this guy around. And there's different ways we can tweak this. Again, if you're a beginner, do not worry about this right now. To the right of that, we have our auto lighting optimizer, which I have turned off for now. This helps deal with certain things like contrast and a little bit of the dynamic range in certain settings. It's disabled in manual and bulb modes, but I leave it turned off most of the time. To the right of that, we have our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connection. To the right of that, we have our customizable buttons. If you want to customize how your buttons work, you would come in here and identify the button in white. That's what's highlighted. As you scroll through it, you can see the different customizations we have. If I wanted to change, let's say the MFN button, I could press that. For now, I would definitely recommend leaving it where it is, but you can see there's a huge amount of customizations available. Come back out. We also have the ability to customize our dials and, as I was mentioning earlier, the control ring. So if you wanted to put a custom function on your control ring, you could do that as well. On the next row, we have what I like to call our focusing clusters. We'll talk about this in the focusing lesson. The focusing clusters allow us to determine the size and the area of where we're telling the camera to focus. They're really cool. They've gotten really good in the last couple of years on Canon cameras. Next to the right of that, we have our focusing modes, whether it's a one-shot lock focus or a continuous focus. We'll talk about this in the focusing lesson a little later. To the right of that, we have our metering modes. This is how the camera measures light coming through the lens. And to the right of that, we have our drive modes. This is what the camera is going to do with the shutter after we push the shutter button down all the way. Whether it's a single shot, a burst, a low speed burst, 10-second timer, a 2-second timer, or a self-timer continuous burst. Typically, when I am shooting stills, portraits, landscapes, I'm almost always on the single frame mode. And when I am doing sports shooting, I'm almost always on a continuous burst mode. We have a medium and a low speed. Obviously, if you're doing family pictures and you don't want to shake the camera, that's when you'd use the timer. And the self-timer continuous works by allowing us to determine how many images the camera will take, between 2 to 10 images after a 10-second timer. Also pretty handy. For now, let's just keep it on single shooting. Finally, we have our image quality. So let me explain this in the deep menu. If I press the menu button, it's the first tab right here, first page, image quality. It's essentially the same menu. The colors are a little bit different. When we look at this, we get a lot of cool information. 24 megapixels is the maximum resolution of our sensor, 6,000 pixels wide by 4,000 pixels tall, multiplied gives you 24 megapixels. Again, the bracket, we've seen this before, this is the number of shots remaining we have with these current camera settings. So watch what happens when I select RAW. That number goes down quite a bit. And the reason is because RAW files are huge. RAW files are the total data captured by the memory card, and they allow for a huge amount of editing. They're not unlimited, but all of the color information is in there, and you can really push the files. So if you're doing paid work, if you're doing landscape photography or certain types of higher dynamic range photography, definitely recommend shooting in RAW. CRAW is compressed RAW. It's about 20% of the file size as full RAW, and it is very difficult for most people to see the differences between RAW and CRAW. CRAW is much smaller, but again, it doesn't have all of the color information, but you can really push them pretty far. The differences between these two is that you will see some chunky artifacts sometimes when you have brights next to darks. So if you're an astrophotographer, I would not recommend CRAW. And you would also notice different chunks of patterns showing up like on black backgrounds. You can see it. Very difficult to see otherwise. Most people aren't really worried about it. But if you're pixel peeping and you're shooting high dynamic range files that you need to push, shoot in RAW. Also for professional types of shots. When you're getting started and you're learning, what I would recommend is shoot on Jagged L. People are always surprised when I tell them this. When I got started, I was shocked to learn that most of the pro photographers who I really respected were shooting on Jagged L at the time. So there's a smooth L and there's a Jagged L. What is the difference between these two? This deals with the amount of compression that the processor applies to the image when it's being recorded. Compression means it essentially looks at similar pixels that are close in color and it says, okay, they're the same color, and it throws out some information to save file space. Even though the resolution on both of these is the same, 24 megapixels for a large size, the file size for jagged L is about half the size as it is for the smooth L. This is going to become much more important when you are shooting thousands of images, for example, at a sporting event or at a wedding reception. If you're shooting 5,000 images in your workflow, this is going to make a huge difference. And I spent days trying to see the difference between these two, and to the naked eye, it's almost impossible for most shooting situations. So yeah, I tell people shoot on jagged L. When you're getting started, when you start getting into the pro stuff, then you're going to start shooting raw. Now we also have these other settings in here. M stands for medium, and you can see that it gives us 11 megapixels. The pixel dimensions of the final image are smaller. Again, we have our compression types, smooth versus jagged. And then we have our small size one, 5.9 megapixels. Small one, jagged and smooth. And then small two is 3.8 megapixels. Sometimes people ask, why would you want to set that on there? Let's say you're putting a gallery online. So in our web browsers, we don't need as much resolution as when we're printing. So some people will do this, but the recommendation I always give to beginners, shoot on jagged L, because you're going to be using your whole sensor. It's going to give you some practice, especially when you're experimenting and trying some things out. It is much easier to take a large image and make it smaller. It's a lot harder to make a small image and make it larger. It's much easier to go this way. But there are some people I know who shoot on medium and small regularly just for the type of work they're doing. I know it's a lot of information, but those are your quality settings. Coming back to our quick screen, we have a couple other things. We have our battery indicator, our Wi-Fi indicator, our Bluetooth indicator, and we have the number of shots with the current settings with that buffer. Having said all that, we're going to push the info button again to come to this screen. This is essentially an overlay version of the menu we just went through. And the way this works is you get two columns, one on the left, one on the right, and we can navigate by touching or using our directional pad. And there's a couple other new things in here, but most of these we've seen already. The option that is highlighted will show its different selections on the bottom row. So this is our focusing clusters. If I press the Q button, these are our camera's focusing modes. This is subject detection, in this case, humans. We also have animals, vehicles. We can turn it off altogether, or we can allow the camera to determine the type of subject we are shooting. I will demonstrate eye detection when we get into the focusing lesson. Below that, we have our image quality, which we just talked about. We can change it from here if we wanted to. Here we have our drive modes, which we've already discussed a little bit. Below that, we have our metering modes. Talk about that a little bit later. We can return to the main menu. This is our anti-flicker shooting mode. And essentially, this is to help you when you're shooting in certain types of lamps that flicker so fast that our eyes cannot see it. I've only seen this one time when I was shooting outside on some sodium-based lamps. The color was changing from shot to shot. Sometimes it was blue, sometimes it was orange. So if you turn your flicker control on, the camera will detect that and it will shoot in such a way that it'll try to match the flickering so your shots are consistent. Very rare to actually use that, and it will slow your burst down if you're shooting in a high-speed burst mode. Here we have our white balance, talking about this a little bit later. We have our picture styles, which we talked about. Creative filters, which I don't really use. They're kind of gimmicky, but they're fun to play with if you're bored. And then we have our aspect ratio, which I recommend leaving on full. We can punch in to a crop mode. We can shoot at a square ratio. We can shoot by 4/3, or we can shoot at a 16:19 if we wanted to. And that is the quick menu in the overlay screen. So we've talked about all of the icons and numbers and letters that you've seen in stills mode. There's a little bit more when we flip our switch over here to video mode. You'll notice that when we do this, the screen changes, we get a little bit of this cropping. What's happening is this is turning into the 16:9 aspect ratio. And you'll see many of these symbols have changed. So if we were to press the Q button here, we have our focusing clusters again. We have subject detection. Third thing in here is the volume of the microphone. So the microphones in the front of the camera are picking up this audio. But what I want you to do is to come in to the menu, first tab, first page, and come to sound recording and turn this from auto to manual. And when you do this, it is going to give you control over the audio gain coming into the camera. You'll notice that it goes from white, yellow. And if it's really loud, you'll see these little red boxes fill up. So anytime it goes over red, that means we're losing the signal and the audio is going to sound really bad. If we leave this on auto, what happens is the camera fluctuates the gain up and down depending on when someone's talking and when they're silent. So there's this constant mismatch in terms of the volume. It creates all kinds of problems. Turn it to manual and then turn your settings down. So when you're testing your microphones, try to stay in this yellow to orange range. We don't want it to be in red. We don't really want it to be in white, but it'd be better if it was in this white range than if it's towards the far end. This is how you set your audio levels for manual recording on video. A couple other side notes is I usually have the wind filter turned off. I also come in and turn off audio noise reduction because I clean up the audio. We do this on all the videos. We're going to do it on this video. We remove the noise ourselves, and it's just faster and more precise to do it. So this is the setting I have up for my sound recording. Tap the shutter button, press the Q button again. Below that, we have our movie record settings. I'm going to press set so you can see this. There's a lot of complicated numbers here. Suffice it to say, it's showing us a few different things. The first is this number is the resolution, how many pixels wide by how many pixels tall the final video will be. Next to it, we have the number of frames, in this case, about 60 frames. And then we have our compression type, IPB. It basically means the processor is looking at the image before and after the current one, and it's calculating what's changed, and it's throwing away any information it can instead of trying to compute for every pixel. That's the short description of it. As we come through this list, you can see we can get light IPB, which is more compression. You can see that there's a difference in the record times. So probably twice as much compression here. We have our standard IPB, but it's at 30 frames per second. Now we have light IPB at 24 frames per second. The short answer on this is that if you are shooting for video, like YouTube, typically I recommend 30 frames per second. If you are shooting for a film, you're typically shooting at 24 frames per second, but you're also going to want to keep in mind your compression type. So I'd probably shoot in here on this case. FHD is full HD. Look how the pixel dimensions have changed. 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second. Then we have different compression types, 30 frames per second. And then we have light IPB, standard IPB at 24 frames per second. So there's tons of different settings. If you're just getting started and you're shooting for YouTube, start on standard IPB, 4K, 30 frames per second, and press OK. Movie digital image stabilization essentially gives the camera permission to zoom in on our videos and crop the sides and the tops out in order to stabilize it. It's not something that I personally do. I use a gimbal. I usually demonstrate this on the crash course. If you want steady video, the way to do it is to shoot it on a gimbal. But if you have nothing else and you want to take this video and put it online quickly, that could be a nice tool. Just know that you're going to lose some of your resolution. Coming back out, this guy here, Servo AF, means the camera is going to be focusing for video. Let's talk about this a little bit more in the focusing lesson. This little guy right here is a thermometer. This is a heat indicator. If we do a lot of shooting, you may see this turn on or turn red, warning us that the camera is overheating. We have our shutter speed, aperture, and we have an exposure compensation setting right here. I wonder how it's changing it, probably with ISO. We have our auto ISO. Again, I recommend turning this to an actual number. Put it on 800. Coming back into our Q menu, we have our white balance, picture styles, we have our creative filters, and we also have digital zoom, which basically tells the camera to zoom in digitally. Again, we're losing resolution. It's something you can also do in post. Before we get into the mode dial and the exposure settings, I want to give a demonstration of ISO and what we're dealing with, something that you should be aware of as you're shooting. So in this case, I have a relatively low ISO 400. I'm going to, let me open up my aperture a little bit, and I'm going to put the focusing square on the blinds, take a picture. So now that I've taken a picture at ISO 400 and I zoom in, I get a nice defined edge of that blind. Now we're going to do it again. So let's just go to, I don't know, something like 12,800. Take a picture of the blind again. There's some other things going on here with banding, but when we zoom in on that previously detailed sharp edge, it's actually doing not so bad, but there is grain. It's like salt and pepper that was not there before. Let me show you on the previous picture. See how much sharper that is? Look at the detail difference between this at ISO 400 at ISO 12,800. Significant difference. There's a lot of grain. And so that's the trade-off with very high ISOs, is that as we increase the ISO, we're going to get more boost to the signal, but it's also going to add more grain. And we're in a pretty well lit environment right now, but if you do this in a low light situation, the higher ISOs are going to look pretty rough. Something you should just keep in mind. So now we've come to probably the most important lesson on this video. We're going to talk about the mode dial, but more importantly, we're going to talk about changing our exposure settings, which is really image brightness in these modes. You'll notice that the modes are on your mode dial right here. And one of those modes is this green A plus symbol. This is what I call the dummy mode. The dummy mode turns the camera into a point and shoot. You still get the benefit of a full frame sensor, but you'll notice that almost all of our controls are gone. We can't control our shutter speed, aperture, ISO. We can control like our image quality, maybe our drive modes, maybe touch focus, and that's really it. We also have these, this kind of like semi-intuitive way. I do not recommend shooting this way because you've invested a huge amount of money into this camera, and I want you to maximize the potential that you're getting out of it. So if you are in doubt and you're confused and you don't know what to do and you just want to go out and shoot, what I would recommend is shoot on the P mode, the program mode. So you would rotate your dial to P, and if you hit the Q button, now you get access to a lot of these other controls. It's sort of like taking the training wheels off a little bit. We can change our focusing modes and change our focusing squares. But if you are a student of mine, I would strongly recommend starting on aperture priority mode. So this introduces us into talking about changing our exposure settings. Exposure is a fancy word for brightness. So when you hear the word exposure, we're really talking about how bright or how dark the image is. In aperture priority mode, you will notice that we get this semi-sun icon. When it's on the top, it's designating the front control wheel, which I also like to call the primary selector. And the reason I like to call it the primary selector is because it will change the primary setting depending on what mode we're in. So in aperture priority mode, the primary setting is the aperture. My number one finger is going to change the f size. Now, quick review again. Remember that the smaller the f number, the wider the opening of the lens. And the bigger the number, as I rotate this towards f22, what the lens is doing is it's starting to stop down. And it'll get teeny and tiny. It'll get it pretty small. f22 is pretty small. f22, that small opening, is not going to be letting in a lot of light. f4 is going to be opening in a lot more light than f22. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. Now, many of you watching this who are intuitive, you're probably thinking, wait a second, if he's making this opening super small, how come this isn't getting darker? And that is an outstanding question. What I want you to do is put it to like f4.5 or f4, and I want you to tap your shutter button. When we tap our shutter button, we can see our shutter speed. So watch what happens as we go back up to f22. You'll notice the shutter speed is changing. So the smaller the opening, the longer the shutter speed. What's happening here is the camera is compensating with shutter speed when we take our lens opening and we make it small. We're making it darker and darker and darker, and the camera is recognizing this and saying, hey, hang on, you need more light for this to be evenly exposed. So this is the heart of the matter with aperture priority, is that we change the aperture and the camera automatically changes the shutter speed for us to give us a nice even exposure. Now, I want to take this a step further. Make sure you have your camera in hand when you do this. You can always tap the shutter button to see the shutter speed in aperture priority mode. You'll do this a lot during sport shooting. I want you to take your hand and slowly move it in front of the lens like this, and watch what happens to the shutter speed as you do this. So as the lighting conditions are changing, the camera is also automatically updating the shutter speed to adjust for it. If I basically cover the lens, you'll see it'll try to use a very long shutter speed. A quarter of a second is pretty long in photography. And this is the heart of the matter with aperture priority. So we dial in our primary setting with our number one finger, camera makes adjustments to the shutter speed. So the question you probably have is then, well, how in the world do we make it brighter or darker? And that is actually a great question. And I'm going to show you this. The short answer is, if we take a picture and we want to make it brighter than this, we're going to come down to our exposure compensation bar. My ISO is turned up way too high. Let's turn the ISO down. Turn the ISO down. The camera is compensating with the shutter speed for it, because it's making those calculations automatically. Let me take a picture. And now you're asking, okay, that's great. How do I make it brighter? Well, the short answer is right here. It's the exposure compensation bracket right here. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to move it from 0 to 1. You'll notice on the right it's plus, and on the left it's minus. So when I go to +1, take a picture, now it's a little bit brighter. Darker, brighter. And if I came over here to 2, it's even brighter. If I came to 3, it's overexposed. This is way too much. If we went in the opposite direction, -1, you can see that it's getting darker. So the short answer is that in aperture priority mode, we can control the brightness of the image by changing the exposure compensation bar. This guy right here. And I want to point some things out about this real quick. If you look at this bracket or this bar, you'll notice that in the middle there's almost like a baseball home plate with 2 tick marks between every number. So the difference between 0 to 1 is 1 stop. And each of these tick marks represent 1/3 of a stop. So this is +1/3, +2/3, +1. Now, if I was to move this using the thumb wheel, as I'm moving between 0 to 1, you'll notice that when I rotate the thumb wheel 3 times, I'm getting a full stop in either direction. So it's either +1 or -1. And you're probably thinking that's great, but what do those numbers mean? What is a stop? A stop is twice the amount of light as the previous digit. So from 0 to 1, I've doubled my light. From 1 to 2, I'll double my light. And from 2 to 3, I'll double my light. And the same is true in the opposite direction. You get half as much light going in this other direction for each stop. Now, the cool thing about this is I can mathematically demonstrate this, and I'm going to do this right now. Do you remember how I said the thumb wheel is the secondary setting? This is crazy. Watch what happens. So instead of touching on the bar here like this, I'm going to rotate my secondary control wheel, and you'll notice that the exposure compensation bracket is active. Now let's talk about the math. At an even exposure, 1/125th of a second. Take a picture. And when I bump that up one stop, it's at 1/60th of a second. 1/125th plus 1/125th is 2/125ths. And if we do the math, it works out to almost 1/60th of a second. Now, I don't know if you saw that, but there's a metering timer here that it'll disappear in a second. Watch what happens. This will frustrate you if you don't know about this. And if I come in and I'm trying to change my exposure compensation, it's temporarily locked me out. So to activate it again, just tap your shutter button. There it is. So that's just a quick side note. How is a beginner supposed to know that, right? So if you look at our shutter speed right now, it's at 1/60th of a second. And if I go to +2 stops, it's now at 1/30th of a second. Why? Because 1/60th plus 1/60th is 2/60ths. And if we simplify, that's 1/30th. So this shutter speed is twice as long as this shutter speed. And if we were to do it one more time, think about it, take a guess. What's twice as long as 1/30th of a second? So 1/30th plus 1/30th is 2/30ths. Simplified is 1/15th, right? So if you said 1/15th, you're absolutely right. And this is what's happening with exposure compensation, is that when we move to one of these tick marks, we're telling the camera to cheat the brightness a little bit and to make the adjustment on the shutter speed. It would work the same in the opposite direction. So we're at 1/125th. If you're doing the math and you said 1/250th, you're absolutely right. If you said 1/500th, you're absolutely right. And if you said 1/1000th, you're absolutely right. So that is the longer answer in terms of how the exposure compensation bracket works. And you'll notice that the brightness is changing as we go back and forth. And so you have a complete knowledge of exposure compensation. Now, I know it's a lot of information. Watch it again if you need to, because you will be using this for the rest of your photography career. Now, there are a couple side notes about this I would like to make. Is that when I shot weddings back in the day, I would almost exclusively shoot in aperture priority mode when I was moving from the chapel into the lobby to the outdoors. And the reason is those are 3 different lighting conditions. I'm walking backwards. I'm trying to focus, compose. I have a lot of things on my plate. I don't want to trip and fall into that fountain. So I'm letting the camera help me. So the rule of thumb for me is that if I do not have time and I'm running and gunning, I'm typically on aperture priority for photography, sporting events. So soccer, football, anything like that, I'm also shooting aperture priority, because sometimes you get clouds and the lighting conditions change and the camera can really help you. With those 2 things in mind, there's 2 rules I want you to memorize. The first is the 1/60th of a second shutter speed rule. I'm going to turn this down a little bit. When you are shooting, I want you to constantly sneak a peek at your shutter speed. And if you are shooting something still, a cooperating human, a landscape, a building, something that's not moving, this should be your longest shutter speed. You can use faster shutter speeds, and I would recommend it 1/100th, 1/200th, 1/1000th. But if you're hand holding, shooting at 1/60th of a second, even if you're trying to be still, the chances of movement are high. And this seems to be about the point where you start to get blurry images. So if you're trying to shoot at, let's say, I'm going to turn the ISO down a little bit. So if you're trying to shoot at 1/25th of a second, it's probably going to be blurry. Just physics. You're moving, you're swaying, your heart's beating, all of those things will come into play. So keep that in mind. 1/60th of a second for handheld shooting. The other barrier that I would recommend is 1/500th of a second for sports shooting. Depending on your athlete or the vehicle or how fast it's moving, sport shooting really starts at around 1/500. Small kids, maybe not, But birds in flight, race cars, grown adults running, it's going to be even faster, maybe 1/1000th of a second or even faster than that. So the faster your subject moves, the faster the shutter speed you're going to want. But beginning photographers should keep this in mind, 1/500th of a second if you're starting to do sport shooting or faster. The other rule of thumb is I do a lot of shooting in manual, but typically manual I reserve for when I'm not under time constraints. Typically I use manual when I'm using strobes. When I have all day, I'm not shooting thousands of shots. The pace is a little bit slower, and almost exclusively between those two modes with some rare exceptions. That said, let's talk about shutter priority. And you're probably looking at this as TV. This is time value. So time value is the opposite of aperture priority. We have our number one finger, primary selector. On our primary selector is changing the primary setting. So in shutter priority mode, we dial in the shutter speed. And if I tap the shutter button, you will see the camera making adjustments to the aperture to maintain that even exposure. It's the opposite. This is why I like to call this the primary selector. And the thumb button, or the secondary selector, is going to change the secondary setting. That's why I like calling them those two things. So in this case, we can also adjust our exposure compensation, and you can see the camera is making the changes in exposure compensation to the aperture, right? I don't really use shutter priority that much, but it's a good mode to learn about how the camera operates, because you dial in the shutter speed that you want, and the camera is going to help you out with the aperture. Now, there are some problems with this. For example, I was just talking about 1/500th of a second. So beginners will come in and they'll say, okay, 1/500th of a second, I'm ready to shoot. And they'll start trying to shoot. And there's a problem here. The camera is not happy. The aperture is flashing. This is completely black. What the heck is going on? If I look at the image, can't see anything. So when you see this flashing like this, what the camera is telling us is it's reached a limit. It cannot open the aperture wider than f4, and you're going to underexpose this. It's going to be dark. It's complaining. So what I want you to do is think about this for just a moment. I'm in a pretty well lit room, but I'm using a very fast shutter speed. If you were at a sporting event and you couldn't open your aperture more, what would you do? How would you resolve this so you can get an even exposure as you're shooting? If you said bump up your ISO, you are absolutely correct. So if we bump it up to 3200, the blinking has stopped. In some cases, you may even need to go higher than that, right? When I first figured this out, I remember the exact moment it happened. I was shooting. I had an apprenticeship with a very awesome pro photographer, and we're in a chapel, and I was like, man, I can't get the shutter speed I want. Bump your ISO up. Bumped the ISO up, got the shots I wanted, and I was very pumped because it finally clicked that in those situations, and you have to decide between no image and having a little bit grainy, it's probably better to have it a little grainy, right? Bump up the ISO, everything was cool. That is an overview of shutter priority. We change the shutter speed, the camera changes the aperture. In program mode, you'll notice that we don't get an orange icon for the primary selector anymore. They disappear. When I tap the shutter button, then it appears again. And it basically gives us combinations. That's really what this is all about. It's kind of like shutter priority, but there's different combinations that are being spit out. We can also change our exposure compensation, but you notice that sometimes it's the shutter speed, sometimes it's the aperture. So the camera's making changes to both of them. Program mode is great when you're just getting started. It is also the handheld flash mode for Canon, meaning that if you're shooting, let's say, a reception, and you put a speed light on your camera, it's probably going to be easiest to do this in program mode. Flip it to program mode, shoot with the speed light. It's going to solve a lot of your problems. The camera is going to figure out a lot of stuff for you. We still have access to most of our Q settings if we wanted to change those. It's a good mode for beginners, even though I kind of steer people more towards aperture priority in the beginning. We're going to talk about manual mode before we come back to the FV mode. Manual mode is special because we dial in all of the settings. The camera doesn't do any lifting for us. You'll notice that the exposure compensation bar is actually turned off. You can't even access it. I'm pushing on it and thinks I'm trying to focus there. We dial in the shutter speed, we dial in the aperture, And I want you to learn how to dial in the ISO yourself. Every photographer should be comfortable shooting in manual mode, but I would say if you're a beginner, start off with AV mode and then start working with manual. Now, there's a couple side notes in here is that in manual mode, the exposure compensation bar is no longer the exposure compensation bar. It's actually a light meter. So as I change the exposure settings, it's telling us how bright or how dark it predicts the image will be. If this is even, it's going to say, hey, this is about, to get an even shot, this is where you should be shooting. If we use longer exposures, we're letting more light in. Cameras are really, they're light catching devices is what they are. And so this helps us kind of gauge in the manual mode. Now there is another setting in the manual mode I want to talk about, and that is when you shoot on auto ISO. There is a time and place for this. I think it's typically indoor sports like MMA, where you have lights flashing on and off rapidly. You have changing lighting conditions. It's kind of crazy. You just don't have time to change, your shutter speed between each shot. So what's happening here in manual mode is I could come in and say, okay, if I'm shooting MMA and I want, let's say 1/500th of a second, and I'm going to open my aperture as wide as it will go, the camera will bump up the ISO in those situations where it's too dark. And if it's too bright, it will turn the ISO down. That's what auto ISO does for us. I don't really recommend it for most of the other situations because then the camera is constantly changing the ISO and you may not really have a handle on what's happening. But in something like MMA type sporting, it does make a lot of sense. We can even control the range of our auto ISO by coming into the deep menu. We're going to go to red tab. We're going to go to the first tab, page 2, ISO speed settings, and we can change the auto range. If we didn't want it to go over 25,600, we could turn it down, or we could give it more permission to go even higher. So this allows us to set a range. We can also set a minimum shutter speed when, for example, we're shooting in program mode or aperture priority mode. We can say, hey, don't use a shutter speed longer than 1/125th of a second. Very useful. So those are just some side notes on auto ISO. If you want to go back to regular ISO, you just come in and dial it in directly. Now, the next letter we see is B. B stands for the bulb mode. And typically how the bulb mode works on most cameras is the exposure continues as long as the shutter is held down. So you push, hold down, you get the timer that's showing you, and you release it when you're done. This is obviously overexposed. Seems pretty straightforward. The problem with this is on very long exposures, if we're handling the camera, there's going to be some shake. So if you're trying to do, let's say some sort of light trails, you're going to get the motion of your hand in the shot. So we can come into the deep menu, first tab, page 7, bulb timer, turn this on, and we can set the exposure manually. So we'll just say, hey, bulb, why don't you just go for 4 seconds? Hit OK. Then I would come in, and if I don't want any shake at all, I'm going to put it on a 2-second timer, right? So now it's on bulb. I'm not touching the camera. And I add a 4-second shot. So that's good because we can dial in the amount of time, we can put it on a timer and let the camera do the rest. So that's bulb mode. Next on our mode dial, you'll see these letters C1 and C2. These are our custom modes. The idea on this is that the shooting styles for sports is going to be different from the shooting styles for, let's say, scuba diving or portraits or landscape. So the idea on this is that we would come in and we would set the camera up exactly how we like to shoot. I don't know, let's say something like landscape. I like to shoot landscapes at f8, at least the starting point, 1/60th. I'll come in and I'll say, okay, sun icon, and I'll dial in all of the settings that I want. When this is set up the way I like it in manual mode, I'll come into the deep menu, yellow tab, and I'm going to go to custom shooting mode. And I'm going to register the setting under C1. So what that means is that anytime I do my landscape shooting, I don't have to reset the camera up. I can just flip it over. I'll just set it up real quick. Okay. So it's recording and it will remember a lot of those settings. Even menu settings will be saved to that C1 position. So if you're customizing how your focusing modes work, it will remember them at C1. Now, another thing about this is we can set this to auto update. I don't recommend that unless you want the camera to be updated as you are shooting in that C1 or C2 mode. And we could also come in and clear the settings. When I was doing a lot of scuba diving, it did take a lot of tweaking for me to get the camera the way I wanted it. And this would be, that would be ideal when you're doing niche shooting. It takes some time to set the camera up, save it to one of those custom settings. If we continue to rotate the mode dial to these two circles, you'll come to this filter mode. So the filter modes, if you come in here, you can change them by scrolling through. Some of the HDRs are actually kind of cool for sunsets and stuff like that, but I don't really use them. You can see that we're limited in terms of what we're doing. It's kind of like, a filter effect in camera. If we continue to rotate it, then we come to the scene modes, where the idea on this is Canon's trying to make it easier for us instead of remembering all these settings. Now just pick the portrait mode. The problem with this is that when we're shooting in these modes, you can see that we've lost our exposure settings. If we hit the Q button, again, we're losing a lot of the control of the camera, which is why I don't really shoot on them. I don't really recommend using the scene modes. Then we have our automatic mode for video, same thing. Automatic for stills, same thing. And then we come to our FV mode. So FV mode basically means between shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, we determine what we want to change. So in this case, I'll just change it to shutter speed. I'll dial in the shutter speed I want, 1/500th of a second. And the camera will adjust the aperture and the ISO for us. So the idea on this is that whatever is left to auto, the camera will change for us. I know people who love it. I personally don't use it because you can achieve those same results with aperture priority mode, manual mode, or shutter priority mode. But again, I know there's a lot of people that love shooting with it. So that is a quick overview of the mode dial and changing our exposure settings. I know there's a lot of information in there, but if you take the time to learn those concepts, you are going to be off to a tremendous start. Real quick, I wanted to give you a lesson about how to set up your video settings. It's going to be determined on where you are publishing your video. So if you're publishing on YouTube and you're shooting 30 frames per second, that's going to be a little bit different than if you were shooting at 24 frames per second for film. So the way we set this up is we start off with our frames per second. So if I was going to do this for YouTube, okay, here I am, 4K, 30 frames per second. I take my frames per second and I double it, and I take that number and I put it under 1. So in this case, 1/60th of a second. So I set up my shutter speed. There it is, 1/60th of a second. Then I choose the f-stop I want. Maybe I'm shooting landscape at f8. And then I tweak it with my ISO. So this is how we set up our exposure settings when we're talking about video. And then you'd be good to go. Because we're doing this in manual mode for video, these exposure settings will not change. And that's an introduction to setting up your video exposure settings. When we're ready to record video, we can push the record button on top of the camera. We can also push the record button on the screen. The easiest way to learn your camera's focusing systems is to think of them in terms of the how, the when, and the where. How, when, and where. If you focus on those three ideas, this is going to be easy. So how does the camera focus? I've put a little focusing target up there, and I'm going to push the shutter button halfway down. You can see that the box is turning green. I'm hearing a beep, and that's telling me that the camera has engaged its autofocus and it's now locked. I'm going to push the shutter button down all the way to take the picture. That is the most basic, most default way of how we can focus. You'll also notice that we have this AF on button on the back of our camera, and I can push that in, and it also engages the focusing systems, and then I can push the shutter button, take a picture. There's a third way to do this by using the touch shutter enable by touching onto the monitor, and it focuses and takes the picture in one go. I'm going to turn this off for now. So those are three different how the camera focus techniques. But to start off, I would say get comfortable using this halfway shutter button depression. Let's talk about the when the camera is focusing. This deals with the camera's focusing modes. They can be accessed by pressing your Q button, And this second item right here, one shot is what it was on. And it basically means that after we achieve focus, as long as we're holding our shutter button halfway down, the camera will maintain that focus lock. And we could move the position of the camera to recompose. Why would we want to do this? Well, let's say we're on the run and we see something cool and we want to get a focus, but we don't want it in the center of the frame. We want it kind of off to the side of the frame. Recomposing allows us to get a quick focus lock and then rotate the camera or recompose to make it more aesthetically pleasing. Now, this isn't going to work very well on very wide aperture lenses, 2.8 lower, not going to be something you're going to want to do. F4, 5.6, 6.3, this is something you can definitely get away with quite a bit. This other option in here, servo, is a little bit different. When we put the camera on servo mode and engage the focusing systems, you'll notice that we don't get the green box, we get a blue box. We don't get a beep, we don't hear anything. And the difference between one shot and servo is that the camera will focus over and over and over again on that focusing square. So wherever that focusing square is pointing, as long as I turn the camera is refocusing. There's no focusing lock. This means that we want to use the servo focusing mode for sports, birds in flight, things that are moving, children that are not cooperating, because we need to update the focusing to make sure the picture is not blurry. So in regards to the win, this is over and over and over again. It's continuous. Now this third option here, AI focus, is something I don't really use that much anymore. I used to back in the day. This is a hybrid between one shot and servo, meaning that the camera will try to determine whether the subject is moving or not, and then it will adjust to that focusing mode. You can see here, and that's one shot. If I'm moving it around, it says it doesn't like it. It's looking for some contrast, but I've just found that when things are moving, it's a lot more reliable to just go to servo mode. So I really bounce back and forth between these two. So one shot is a one-time focus as long as we hold the shutter button down. Servo is a continuous focus over and over and over again. Now there is another kind of focus, and that's manual. And I have a lens switch here on the side of my lens. I can flip the lens to manual. That means I'm going to manually focus the ring. I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. Turn this back on. So we've talked about the how, we've talked about the when. Now let's talk about the where. This deals with the camera's focusing clusters. And there's a number of ways we can access them. We can push our cluster selector button here by default, and then come into this guy or press our MFN button. And you can see that we get all of these different selections here on the bottom. Spot AF, it's very hard to see. It's a tiny little square. This is the smallest point that the camera will focus on or can focus on. Are we on blue or green? Let's turn this back over to green so you can see it a little better. This is really great for macro photographers, people who need precise focus, if you're doing focus stacking, for example. A second way to access our focusing clusters is in the Q menu. I'm going to go to 1-point autofocus, and here we get a slightly larger square. I use this one probably the most as my general focusing square. Now, something else that's very important to note is that we can change the position of our focusing square by touching on our back monitor. And this can also be done while looking through the viewfinder. You can use the back screen as a touchpad. So we can select our focusing squares and we can change their position using the monitor. When I customize my cameras for rapid shooting, I almost always move the cluster button to something a little bit more direct. And in the case of the R8, I'll probably put it right here, but I'll skip a step so I don't have to press 2 buttons to access it. I'll show you that when we get to the end of the clusters. The third cluster here expands the autofocus area. We get these 4 little squares around it. It just makes the size of the area a little bit bigger if it does not find something of high contrast. This is why I put that target up there. It's very easy for the camera to see, where these blinds, maybe not so much, a little bit tougher. As we continue to look at the clusters, then we get expand AF area around, even a larger size. As we continue, Then we come into our flexible zone AF modes. The thing that is awesome about these three modes is that we can change the size and the shape of the cluster by pressing this guy or directly on the monitor. And you'll notice that we get our front and rear selector wheels. And look how the shape of the box changes as I rotate these. So we could customize it to be like a much larger box, something like this. And when I focus, you can see that the camera is just looking within this area. I don't know, let's say I'm shooting birds in flight and I want it to be a little bit more of a linear pattern. I can change the shape to be towards the middle of the screen here. So this allows us to limit where the camera is looking for our subject matter. As we continue, we finally come to the whole area AF, where we're basically telling the camera, hey, look at everything in the monitor, find something of contrast that is closest to the camera, and the camera will say, okay, I think I see this target here, and this actually has a very useful time and place. If I'm shooting birds in flight against a clean background, like the sky, I'll go to whole area AF. I also use it when I am shooting portraits of a single person. And the reason is the camera has become very good at detecting a face, specifically an eye. Saves a lot of time. Before we had face and eye detection, we had to move a focusing square around. It was not fun. I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. If you want something a little bit faster to customize, so you don't have to go through these menus to get to your focusing squares, this is what I would recommend. Toggle into your info button. I typically don't recommend making changes for beginners, but this is one of the things that just makes it easier. I'm going to come down to this focus cluster button, and I'm going to go to direct AF area selection. So once I've done that, now I can toggle through the clusters just by pressing this directly. And there's a way we can limit the number of boxes in the deep menu. If you come in to our purple tab, limit auto focus areas, and then I could just select the ones that I typically shoot with and turn the others off if you want something a little faster. If that's too confusing, just leave it on default for now. You'll be fine. In fact, I can turn that back, no problem. Let's turn that back. And this is the default. When you're looking through the viewfinder and you're looking for a way, let's change these back, to move your focusing square around, I'm going to show you a really cool thing. To find this, we're going to go into the menu, purple tab, AF, page 4, touch and drag settings. Essentially, we need to turn it on at first. Then we come to the active touch area. The idea on this is that the white part of the little screen there will tell us what part of the back monitor is active in order to focus as we are looking through the EVF. So if I wanted to just use this half part of the screen, I would come in and I would select right. And then looking through the viewfinder, I could touch on the right side of the panel and move the focusing square around. It's very difficult for me to demonstrate this because it's happening here. But just know that as you're looking through the viewfinder, this is probably going to be one of the fastest ways for you to move that focusing square around. We can adjust the positioning method and the relative sensitivity if we want, but definitely try this out when you get a chance. Turn this off for now. Now, there's another way we can do this, but the way the camera arrives by default, it is not set up for this. Canon cameras often have a joystick where you can move your focusing square by pushing on the joystick. And so intuitively, we want to use the directional pad to do that. But by default, it is not set up this way. So let's set this up real quick. We're going to press the info button to come into the black screen, press the Q button. And I do recommend changing this. So as you follow along, we're going to come down to our directional pad. And you can see it says auto, auto, auto. That is for the FV settings. It's to reset your exposure settings in FV mode. We're going to change this to direct AF point selection. Hit OK. Tap the shutter button to come back out. Press the info button. So now we have a way to move our focusing square using our directional pad. This is very handy if you just want a slight adjustment, Or maybe you are left eye dominant and your nose is in that area of using the touch and drag settings. So this is another way that we can change the where of our focusing square is by using the directional pad as a joystick. So we've talked about the how, the when, and the where for basic focusing. Let's talk about some of these other techniques that you're going to want to know. You'll notice that I can move the focusing square around and it'll focus. And I can also press on this magnifying glass and engage the camera's focusing system. Look how close I am, 10x. And I can focus on that if I want to get very precise focusing. Another thing about this is that there are going to be times you do not want the focusing to change and you want to lock it down completely. This is when we go into manual mode. So I flipped my lens switch from autofocus to manual. I'm using the 24 to 105 f4. And now when I zoom in, I can rotate my manual focus ring on my lens to get precise focus lock that I want. I call this technique the manual zoom focusing technique, and it is very handy when you use manual focus. And you can shoot from here. Now, having said that, there are some other manual focusing tools that are very handy. We're going to come into, again, the purple tab, page 5, MF peaking settings. If we turn this on, peaking essentially puts a color overlay. As I rotate my manual focusing ring, you can see a red kind of glowing outline on areas of contrast. And if you use this tool, it's usually pretty accurate when you set it to the brightest, highest color of those peaking indicators. Something you should know about this is that if you try to zoom in using this, you're not going to see that red peaking. But as you zoom out, you should see it pretty easily. And there's also blue and yellow. There are some other tools for manual focusing as well. I'm going to turn this to off. I typically use peaking for video focusing, believe it or not. The focus guide is something I don't really use a lot anymore. And you can see that we get this box with these little tick marks that as I rotate out of focus, those tick marks go further away. And as I come back to it, closer again, eventually they turn green. When they turn green, it's basically saying that the camera has locked in onto this area. It's looking for contrast. And it's another tool that you have in your toolbox for manual focus. I'm going to turn this to off. There is also another focusing technique that I want you to become familiar with called tracking. You need to be aware of it because if you put your camera in that mode and you're not sure what's going on, it's going to be a little weird. So let's take a look at tracking real quick. We're going to go to servo, select that. Then we're going to select our focusing clusters again. And over here to the right, you see this thing that says info with this little ball and these lines coming off from it. If we toggle this and it says on, now the camera is going to start tracking. So if you remember before, when I would move the camera with focusing systems engaged, it would stay fixed onto the screen. Now it's following the subject as it moves. So the camera is doing its best to follow and track. This is very useful for sport shooting if you are dealing with a subject on a clean background. If you're dealing with something like soccer or football and you have 22 people running around, it's not going to work as well. Skier on a white hill, it's going to work great. So you just have to kind of keep this in mind in terms of tracking. It also works great with the whole area AF. Sometimes you'll do this with birds in flight because birds are very, very fast and you don't have time to move that focusing square around. You can see that as I'm engaging the focusing systems, it's doing a great job of following along. And if you see your camera doing this tracking, you don't want it to, come back into info and turn this so it says off. Demonstrate this. And now we are back to a single focusing square that stays fixed. Another really cool little thing is if I move my focusing square and I want to recenter it, that's this guy right there. That'll put it back into the center position. You'll see a little dot in the middle of that square that says this is centered. Let's talk about face and eye detection, subject detection. To activate it, we're going to come into our menu and we're going to look for the third item right here, subject to detect. I'm going to hit people. And what you'll notice is the camera automatically jumps onto one of my eyes. I can push the shutter button halfway down and it'll focus on the eyeball. When we shoot portraits, it's very important to get the eye in focus most of the time, unless you're going for something, abstract or artsy. If you're taking a picture of a person who wants to be represented, we want their eye to be in focus. Something you'll notice is that when we come in here, we also have animals, and I have a picture of a lion in the corner of my room here. Let's see if we can zoom in. And then when we engage the camera's focusing systems, you can see it's starting to track that lion's eyeball. Just by pushing the shutter button halfway down, we're engaging, take the pictures. So something to keep in mind is that humans, it's one species. We have a good idea of what the shape of a human face is. Animals, many tens of thousands of species. Some of these animals are weird, like, praying mantis or grasshopper, snakes, lots of different facial structures. So it seems to work better for humans, but they are getting more efficient at it with time. We can also turn the subject detection to a car. We can enable for all three, let the camera decide, or we can turn it off completely. I'm going to come back to people. Something that I do personally is, instead of needing to come into the menu systems each time, is I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to set up my auto exposure lock button to be eye detection. And I'm going to do that by toggling the info button, coming to this black screen, pressing Q, coming in to customize buttons, and I'm looking for that star button, and I'm going to program this to eye detection AF, just like that. And I actually recommend that you do the same. You may not want to, because this is obviously new, but it makes it a lot easier to just need to press and engage to get eye detection, even when I have eye detection turned off in the menu. This is way faster. I use eye detection way more than exposure lock. I do a lot of portraits, so this is something that I'm going to use a lot. And that is setting up your eye detection on your exposure lock button. Now, there's another customization that many people love to do, especially sports shooters, and this is referred to as back button focusing. The way this works is, let's say we have an athlete who's out on a field and we're focusing them with our front shutter button. They stop and I want to recompose. If I recompose like this, now I'm focusing on the target instead of the person. So what back button focusing does is it allows us to remove focusing from the halfway shutter button depression, and we start focusing continually here. When the athlete stops running, basically we lift our thumb up, autofocus is disengaged, we can recompose, and we can shoot without refocusing on something else. So this is how we set it up. We're going to toggle the info button, coming into the black screen, pressing the Q button, customize buttons. Here's the shutter button, and we're going to select metering start. That removes autofocus from the shutter button. Press OK. So now when we shoot, if I push the shutter button halfway down, nothing's happening. I have to engage with the AF on button. And when we want to disengage, just lift your thumb up and then we can shoot, and there's no refocusing. That's probably a little bit of an intermediate technique, but you should definitely know about it if you start doing lots of sports shooting. Most of my friends who do heavy sport shooting, that's their go-to. But for now, I'm going to come back in, turn it back to the default. You may be more comfortable with the default as you are learning. Let's talk about video focusing. I'm going to flip the camera over to the video camera icon, and many of the things in here are similar. We still get our focusing squares. We can still change our focusing squares in a similar way if I wanted to be a little bit more precise with the 1-point focus. And you'll notice that we should have this servo AF option in the bottom here. And when it's green, that means the camera is going to engage autofocus. So if we come in and we're looking for one shot in AI servo, it's not in there. This is how we can manage it, is by touching on the monitor. And I'm basically racking focus between two depths. I have the target closer to the camera, and you'll notice it's in focus. And then we have this model over here in the background. This technique is very useful. You can do it in real time. You can do it if the subject matter is standing still. Touch on the screen. And then when we get the focusing that we want, we push servo AF off. That means it's basically stopped. We can move the camera around a little bit and it's going to stay focused on that. If it stays engaged and we move the camera, it's going to start focusing on other things. You can see now that it's blurry. If I come back to it, it's in focus again. So it's a little different. Just think of servo AF as continuous focus, and turning it off is sort of like manual, but we can also engage it again by using the AF on button. If we have servo AF turned off and we want to re-engage it temporarily, we can push our AF on button. We can touch on the screen to move the square, refocus, or we can turn servo AF on again and it's resumed. So that's how it works. In the past, when you wanted to rack focus between 2 points like this, it took a person to manually do it. It's still done in Hollywood this way because the humans can be very precise and fast. But with these touch monitors, it allows somebody who's a one-man show to pull focus as they're dealing with different subject matter for video. Typically, when I'm shooting video, most of the time, it's on manual focus. If I'm doing a talking head video, it's a different matter because we know we want to be focused on the eye of a person, right? And the box isn't always the greatest thing it can miss. So if I know I'm doing a talking head video, I will come in to make sure that my subject detection human is on and I'm getting the eye detection that I want. Server will update. That way I can move around a little bit. If it's a video for YouTube, in focusing will update, even if I zoom in and out, or even if I just move around. Very handy for talking heads. That's what I would recommend, is using servo AF with eye detection if it's one person. If it's two people, you're going to see a different problem where the camera will need to decide which one to focus on, and you can touch on the monitor for that. But as more and more people come into the frame, I typically turn off focus. I'll focus in the depth of field on the person, turn it off, and that way the camera is not jumping around a lot. We have a great Facebook group, and there was somebody the other day who's like upset because their face detection wasn't really working right. So I looked at the background, and the background was really busy, and the camera was confused by the background. It couldn't really find the face of a person, and that happens sometimes. So in instances where I want to turn focus off, but still kind of focus in the depth of field, what I'll do is I'll turn off servo AF. I'll touch approximately where I want to focus. I'll go into manual mode. I'll zoom in. And now I can achieve precise focus lock. Zoom in even more. When I get the focus that I want, I'll just start recording. Just like that. The thing with this, though, is you have to stay within that depth of field. If you move out of it, it will become blurry. But if you're shooting multiple people, kind of hanging out and talking, this is the way to go, is just to put it into manual focus. Otherwise, the camera is going to be shifting and moving around a lot. It can get really frustrating. And also, if it's confused by the background, go into a manual focus for video and just stand within the depth of field. I go into this a lot on the crash course, and I demonstrate how to do this. So the background on white balance is basically that our eyes are very sophisticated and make adjustments continually to the light that we are in, whether it's a tungsten light, a fluorescent light, whether we're outdoors, indoors, in clouds. Our eyes are very good at changing the perception of how light is seen. Cameras are limited because they're dealing with a sensor. Sensors are not as sophisticated as the human eye, and sensors see light differently. They see light for what it is the colors that they actually emit. The short answer is, if you're a beginner, shoot an auto white balance. As you start to see these color shifts, change them to the icon of the light you're shooting in. In many cases, this will not be sufficient. Look at this, almost like purplish light for fluorescent. We have strobes. And then we come to these last two guys. We have a custom white balance. Used to do this all the time with brides' dresses because I'd be in mixed lighting conditions. Press this guy to tell the camera what white is. It says this is white, date is attained. Okay, we'll set it. So if you're shooting in mixed lighting conditions, go for custom white balance. You can use, a white card, a piece of paper, anything that's white. Take a picture of it with this custom white balance. We also have this Kelvin setting, which I use all the time because I know the lights that I'm shooting in. I'm shooting in 5100 temperature lights, so I can just come in here and set the color temperature to 5100, right? And this is part of the longer answer of what's happening. Kelvin is a scientific measurement for light color. It's an actual temperature, and as that temperature is lower for the light, let's say candlelight at 2600, well, candlelight is very yellow. So what's happening here is the camera is adding blue to counterbalance it. And if we were shooting in candlelight with a Kelvin setting of 2600 for our white balance, this would look nice and even. People are confused when I say it. They're like, what? I'm like, yeah. The camera, what it's doing with white balance is it's adding the opposite of the color that we're shooting in. So let's say we go in the opposite direction, and I'm shooting in a garage full of blue blowtorches. There's blue blowtorches everywhere. It's very hot Kelvin temperature, like 9,000. Okay. So when I turn my Kelvin temperature high on the camera all the way up to 8,000 or 9,000, you can see how orange it is. The camera is adding orange light to counterbalance the very high Kelvin temperature. So this is what's happening on all of these white balance settings, is we're having the camera add different colors to even things out. And that's the longer answer for white balance. But again, if you're a beginner, start off with auto white balance. When you start to see the shifts, go with the icon of the light you're shooting in. If you're doing video work or you're shooting in mixed lighting conditions, custom white balance. If you're shooting in consistent light and you know the temperature, just dial it in directly. I'm going to change this down to 5100. And that is a quick overview of changing your white balance. Let me demonstrate some things on our metering modes. And for the sake of discussion, if you're a pure beginner, I like the evaluative metering, it's fine. But to demonstrate some things, we're going to go into the spot metering mode and look at this flashlight that I've set up. When I tap the shutter button, we can see that the camera is measuring the light, and it's recommending a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second. Pretty straightforward, right? But you see this black circle here for spot metering mode. What happens is that as I move it over the flashlight, the shutter speed recommendation changes dramatically. 1/1000th, 1/1250th of a second. And as I keep moving it past, then we go back to this 1/80th, 1/60th. So what's happening here is the camera is measuring light only within that circle. When we're doing the hand thing in the beginning, that was dealing with the whole frame. And now it's only measuring light from this little black circle here. If we were to change it to the partial metering mode, you can see a larger circle. Same basic concept is the camera in aperture priority mode is going to make adjustments based on the light coming in that circle and nowhere else, really. As long as that light's not in the circle, camera doesn't even notice it. We can expand that size a little bit more with a center weighted average, which uses a larger part, and then it averages it out. You can see that as we rotate it, we don't get those really super fast shutter speeds anymore because there's this averaging happening. And then finally, we get to the evaluative metering mode, which is really what you should be using if you're a pure beginner. The camera is going to break it up into different patterns, do some calculations, figure out what it thinks is the best, and it's usually pretty good when you're just getting started. So essentially, the metering modes allow us to determine the shapes or patterns the camera is using to measure light and to calculate a recommended exposure setting depending on the mode that we're in. Let me give you some gear and lens recommendations. Now, we've already talked about memory cards. I'm a big fan of the SanDisk Extreme Pros, as I've already pointed out. In regards to batteries, I like the original manufacturer batteries. There's tons of knockoff battery brands out there. I don't recommend them because sometimes there are problems with them. They don't work as well. Sometimes they blow up or catch on fire. There's things like that going on. If you bought a really nice camera, it just makes sense to buy good batteries for it. If this is your first camera, you probably don't have a tripod yet. It's probably the best first piece of gear that you should get. Your tripod is going to allow you to put your camera in places where you don't have to hold it, especially if you're in front of the camera or if you're doing anything with video work, landscape photography, long exposures. Tripods have a multitude of uses and purposes. I personally prefer the carbon fiber legs. They're more expensive, and the nice ones can run as much as $400 or $500. But Bogen Manfrotto and some other manufacturers make some decent aluminum travel ones that you could probably get less than $200. It's important to invest into your tripod. You don't want to go and buy that Walmart tripod for $50 because they will break over time. If you had to do it and you had nothing else, sure. But a tripod is an investment you're going to want to last for, 5 to 10 years. And that's why I like the carbon fiber Bogen Manfrottos. If you are looking to save as much money as possible, or you're coming from an existing Canon EF mount, you really can't do better than the EF to RF adapter. The basic mount costs $100. This device is very special because it'll allow you to use some of the older Canon EF lenses on your new RF mount. The new mirrorless mount is referred to as RF. So anytime you're looking at lenses, make sure that you notice whether it says EF or RF. The RF are the newer lenses. Those are the ones you're going to want to get. At some point, you are going to need to get yourself a set of filters, especially if you are a landscape photographer, if you do video work, if you're doing a lot of strobe work for portraits, or you want to get creative with long exposures. You will need a set of ND filters, and especially for landscape photographers, you'll need a polarizer. I can make a great recommendation, and that is of the Maven magnetic filter line. We also have a threaded line called the Maven High Standard. Either of those are available in the link in my descriptions. You can get a whole set of Maven filters for a very affordable price, and they have a lifetime warranty. In my opinion, they are the best out there. Now, if you get into video work, you're going to need to invest into a microphone because the microphone on the camera doesn't really work that great. As you're handling the camera, as you're changing the zoom, you're going to hear it in the camera. It just picks up a lot of the noise and vibrations. It's not a really high quality one. There are two different microphones that I recommend. If you're just getting started and you need a general purpose microphone, I would say get the Maven mic. That's sold on our website as well as Amazon. We put that through a battery of tests, and it was the winner among the most popular brands when we were designing it. It's affordable. It's like $50. Many of you will be tempted to go out and buy the Rode microphone. It's a $300 microphone and probably a little bit more than what you need for a general purpose mic. If you are doing on-camera work like this, I would strongly recommend a lavalier mic. And I'm wearing Countryman. It's kind of expensive, but it's a really good mic. And then you'll need a transmitter and a receiver pack. In the past, I typically stuck with the Sennheiser E100 series. Very reliable, very high quality audio. I have also recently tried the new DJI mic. It is a really incredible pack. It allows you to record two voices into the same transmitter. Really nice microphone set. I also highly recommend that if you're looking for a lav set. Very affordable. You basically have a backup, or you can do two people at once. Really awesome. When we're considering lenses for the R8, remember that this is a full frame sensor. Therefore, we want full frame lenses. If we try to use crop sensor lenses on it, we're going to get, it's not going to cover the image circle, and you'll get an incredible vignetting around your image. So for beginner full frame lenses on the R8, I really like the 24-105 f4. It's a kit lens, but it is an L kit lens. Runs about $1,200 at the time of this recording. I've owned multiple versions of it. It is reliable, it is sharp, and it lives on most of my full frame Canon RF mount cameras. Now, if you get into portraits or wedding photography, the go-to there is the 70-200 2.8. It's very expensive, but you're getting top of the line quality. And if you end up shooting safaris or sports or wildlife, and you're looking for a really good telephoto lens, I know a lot of people don't like me saying this, that 100 or 400 RF, it's like $500 or $600. It's an incredible value. I've purchased two of them. I have brought one on a safari, lent it to a buddy. He was so impressed with it. He bought it off me on the spot. He said, I need to have this lens. I'm like, all right. I say that because there's another lens, a 100 to 500. Obviously, it's better. It's sharper. It's an L lens. But that 100 to 400 should not be underestimated. A couple really good value ones are the 16 2.8. It's a wide angle. It's not the sharpest in the world, but if you're on a tight budget and you need to get a wide angle lens, it's pretty good. There's also the 50 millimeter 1.8, which is a great portrait lens on an APS-C. It's decent on full frame. The nifty 50, it's about $200. Great value of a lens. When we're talking about wide angle for the Canon, the flagship is the 15 to 35 2.8. It's a big, heavy lens, but it's probably the best one that Canon makes. There's also a 14-35 f4. I own both of them and I use both of them. The 14-35 is more portable, it's smaller, it's lighter. So if I'm going on a long trip, I tend to go with the 14-35. If I'm doing video work with, in the studio, I tend to go more with the 15-35. In any event, if you enjoyed this video, I would love to get a like from you. It helps the algorithm allow me to find more students just like you. And if you want to take your training to the next level, definitely check out my crash course on the Canon R8. That link is in the description. If it's not ready, it'll take you to my blog. If you leave your name and your email address, we will reach out to you as soon as it's ready. Again, thank you so much for joining me on this tutorial of the Canon R8. Thank you for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.